right, I know that some of you are still digesting your supper, and we are going to go right into this evening and deal with a pretty hot, heavy topic. I've entitled this talk, Cult of World Order. And I've entitled it this way because I want you to think differently about a subject. I want you to think differently. Oh, we don't have PowerPoint up. We need to get the PowerPoint up. Away the projector. All right. That's how things go. Let me just unplug and plug back in. All right, while we wait for somebody who will turn on the projector, I will just give you a little bit of a breakdown of what we'll be talking about this evening. We want to examine the idea of world order as a cult, as a religious movement. It's easy to talk about it within Christian circles and conservative circles as conspiracy. I don't want you to think along those lines. Instead, this evening, it's important, and I think it's very important as we progress, that what we are indeed talking about is a religious worldview. It is a belief system. It has a faith. It has a hope. It has values. And it definitely has a salvation message. The title of my book is Game of Gods. And it can be summed up with a sentence. Humanity has three great desires: to be as God, to be masters of meaning and destiny, and to build heaven on earth. Oh, it's still not up. Okay. And what we're going to be looking at in terms of the cult of world order, and I want you to think about it as a cult, is that it is constructing heaven on earth. It is offering an alternative salvation message. So why? Why go into something like this? This morning I broke down some of the reasons why we should engage in trying to understand the worldview around us, the change of our culture. But I think it's important that we review some of this and dive into it from a slightly different angle as well. Number one, first of all, so that you're not uninformed as to what the culture is doing, so that you're not uninformed as to the direction of society. I want you to see past the hype. I want you to see past the misinformation. I want you to see past the sensationalism. I want you to be grounded and to think deeply about some of these topics. It's important to study some of this so that we understand how society is preaching to us, the message that is being given to us. I want you to go past the packaging in order to be able to spot the worldview being sold to you. I also want you to be warned so you have an understanding, so you don't become a gullible participant. And at the end of this presentation, if I can get the slides up, you'll be seeing an example, 3 examples of where we have been gullible participants of world order. So we want to be warned of this so that we are aware, so we don't become gullible participants ourselves, so our churches do not succumb. And if our churches do go into that type of thinking, we have a vantage point, a place to begin to work with. Finally, the important part I want you to take away in doing this presentation is that there is a context here. It is so important that you understand that there is an historical, biblical context to what we're talking about regarding world order. You need to grasp this, understand this, that there are grand themes, and this is a grand theme, what we're talking about, a grand theme that influences the scope and impact of the larger human story, that it impacts how we look towards humanity and developing the idea of a world order or a unified humanity within this idea of a big redemption story. It is the idea of politics as salvation. This morning I brought forward to you the idea of one versus two, oneism versus twoism. Oh, here we go. We'll see what happens. Oneism versus twoism. There is only really two ways you can look at ultimate reality. My friend Dr. Peter Jones puts this well together, and I like using his methodology because it's an effective methodology. Tomorrow we're going to be talking a little bit about that and how we employ it when I go to Burning Man and when we engage in trying to literally witness to our new pagan culture. But oneism and twoism, the concept of ultimate reality breaking down into one of those two blocks, is so important. Oneism says God, man, and nature are essentially one, that their core characteristics are the same. At that level, we all are one. All is within the all. The biblical worldview says, no, God is distinct. He is different than the created order. The reality is God and everything else. God and creation. Reality is two. Peter Jones puts us in the aspect of oneism versus twoism. I like using the language of oneness versus otherness. But they both speak to the same thing. Now, how you view these two things will have a huge impact on your worldview, how you consider politics, economics, how you think in terms of ethics, law, morality, gender, sexuality. All of this is completely colored by how you view ultimate reality. God as separate or everything as one. And tonight we're going to be diving into the political side of that belief of oneism. I'm going to have to ask you a question. Oh, we have something happening. Yay! Thank you, folks. We'll see. So the question is this. Which is the first city in the Bible? Can anybody here name me the first city in the Bible? Who here wants to say Babel? It's not Babel. Nope. Nope. Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4, the first city of the Bible, is the city of Enoch. In Genesis 4, verses 10 to 17, there we go. Look at that. Hey, thank you for the tech people. Yay! I was prepared to do the slides without you seeing anything, but golly, there's some stuff in here I really want you to see. Especially because I love presenting it from an evidence point of view. In fact, that's really important. It's essential that we deal with these topics from an evidence point of view. Not hearsay, not sensationalism, not rumor, but evidence. So the first city in the Bible we find is the city of Enoch in Genesis chapter 4. And here Cain has been cursed to wander after he has murdered Abel. You know the story. He is now without a home. He is cursed to wander. As you read through that passage, you realize he's terrified. He begs God. He begs God not to have this happen to him. And so what does God do in Genesis chapter 4? He offers Cain security. He offers Cain his own hand of protection. And I would encourage you to read through that passage. But he has to wander. That is his curse. So how does Cain respond? How does Cain respond to the consequences of his sin? He responds by building a city. In other words, he places his own security within his hands. I like how Jacques Ellul, the French theologian, puts this. I don't agree with everything Jacques Ellul says. Sometimes I don't understand everything Jacques Ellul says. But he makes some really interesting points regarding the spirit of the city. This is what he said in his book, The Meaning of the City. The city for Cain is first of all the place where he can be himself, his homeland, the one settled spot in his wandering. Second, it is a material sign of his security. He is responsible for himself. For God's Eden, he substitutes his own. For the goal given to his life, he substitutes a goal chosen by himself, just as he substituted his own security for God's. Ellul says this, when man is faced with a curse, he answers, I'll take care of my problems alone. And he puts everything to work to become powerful, to keep the curse from having its effects. He creates the arts and sciences. He raises an army. He constructs chariots. He builds cities. The spirit of might is a response to the divine curse. And the rule breaks down the meaning of the city this way. It represents man's attempt at self-security. It is a place where war is waged. It is the location, the center, the hub of where we have our idols, our money, our power, our strength, our might. We project it always from this city, from this point of concentration. It is a place where we make a name for ourselves. It is our pride. It is a place that we create in the affirmation that we can be independent from God because now we have built our own place of security. This is not to say that every city thinks like this. We don't think like this. Fargo, your town council doesn't sit down and go, maybe we should construct ourselves with these philosophies in mind. No. This is, you could call it that symbolic meaning of what the city represents. For God's natural garden, we create an artificial Eden. It is a setting and symbol of our own order, our own collective reality. Pretty intense stuff to pop out of Genesis chapter 4. Now let's jump into the city that most of you are more familiar with. I said city because as we read through Genesis chapter 11, I like the fact that Paul tackled it before, later or early on today, before supper. He tackled the whole Babel, Genesis chapter 11 scenario. And we're going to do something very similar, some parallels. And Paul and I didn't discuss this. It just happened to be that way, which is pretty cool. We tend to think of the Babel story in the context of the tower. And while the tower is important, as you read through this text, you realize it's a tower and a city. It's a complex. It wasn't just one, it was both. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had brick for stone and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." And they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. All right, let's break this down a bit. Let's tear it apart and see what else we can pull out of this. First of all, there's one original language. It is obviously the language that allows them to build together. And they are constructing a tower city complex. Man builds upward. Man expands and builds in unity. The purpose is to reach into the heavens and to make a name for themselves. The concept of renown, fame, and we will build into the highest heavens. That is the language that's being presented. Why? Lest they be scattered. Lest they be scattered. Verse 6, the Hebrew transliteration for what they begin is shalal, and it means literally to defile or profane something. So what they begin to do is not a positive. This is not seal of approval. This is an act of defiling or profaning. That is the flavoring that's coming through with the Hebrew. To be withheld in verse 6, or the other way of looking at it is, it will be impossible, is the transliteration bastard. That is to fortify, to make inaccessible against somebody trying to come in. It is a fortification. It's not just simply I'm building upwards or I'm building some construction, look at me. No, this is a fortification. We do this to keep somebody out. So what happens? God comes down. God comes down to examine the project, and he imposes judgment. and the people disperse, and the project stops. I contend that there's grace in all of this. God is demonstrating grace, and we see this in verse 6, that if they were left to succeed, the feeling behind it, the idea behind it is that they would even be able to do greater acts of idolatry. If they did greater acts of idolatry, greater judgment even comes yet. By stepping in when he does and stopping the project when he does, he is exhibiting grace, because they could do anything their minds conceived in unity. And if they would be able to continue, there would have been, I believe, a harsher punishment yet. So what can we pull out? Well, there's solidarity and self-naming. They define their purpose. There's a declared independence from God. In other words, they are literally pursuing their own order together. They are framing their own security. They are achieving power in unity. And all this is done through the works of their own hands. It is an act of collective idolatry. This fits, coming way forward now, up into our modern era, this fits with what Benjamin Kidd, a British sociologist, said back in 1918. He believed that humanity was becoming one in power. And he had the high aspiration that we were all moving into a collective mindset. He wrote in his book, The Science of Power, believing that power came through our unity, he said this: civilization is absolutely invincible once it realizes the secret of its own unity. This is the law of integration. He believed that the individual would move into the group would come together under the concept of being embodied within a universal or a uniform mind, and that we would become one in our power. We would unify. So with this in mind, I want to jump into the realm of global politics, the cult of world order. And I want you to see this as man's attempt to build heaven on earth. This is our desire to frame our own security, to rebuild Eden in our own image, to say we are in control and we are constructing our own salvation. And I think as we get to the end, you're going to see why I put it in that kind of language. A brief history. And really this exercise from here on in is to give you examples, evidence, the continuity of this large idea of world unification, which is really just Babel. It is Babel now within our context. If you take a look at the history of world unification, you can see that the idea goes back in the modern sense a long ways, back to the year 1600 with Johann Comenius, with his idea that all men are citizens of the world. Moving forward, in 1873, the founder of the Baha'i faith coins a phrase. No, George Bush Sr. did not coin this phrase. The founder of the Baha'i faith coined this phrase, the New World Order. That was his term, with the meaning and intent being that man is coming together in every aspect. We are unifying in all ways. In 1889, the Interparliamentary Union was birthed because they could see a new century on the horizon, a century of great peace, a century of unity, of coming together. We would all be a part of the commonwealth of man. In 1899, what was known as the Hague Peace Process was put into place, the idea of creating a permanent world court system that still exists today. All of this was couched in the idea that we are entering a new era of great peace. Teddy Roosevelt, in his 1910 Nobel Prize speech, stressed that we are entering an age when we need now to build a world federation. This is Teddy Roosevelt. We need to build a world federation built on the American model, working alongside these Hague courts of law. What we need, he said, is literally a league of peace to enforce peace. And then he said this, very interesting: the ruler or statesman who should bring about such a combination would have earned his place in history for all time and his title to the gratitude of all mankind. This is our Savior. Whoever can do this. would have the veneration of all of mankind, because now peace on earth is secured. Well, we all know what happened, don't we, in the 20th century? Was it peace on earth? Did we create a new Eden? No, we blew each other to smithereens. It was the most bloody century of human history, both in war and by the hands of government against its own people. But the dream of world order, of a new Eden, of a new salvation, was certainly evident all throughout the century. I'll give you one example. In 1913, an American architect living in Rome suggested that what we need to have is a world capital, and that this international world capital would be the crowning jewel of man's progress and world peace. In the center of this city tower complex would be an incredible edifice, what he called the Tower of Progress, over 1,000 feet high. Surrounding it would be international halls of justice, religions, banks. Heinrich Andersen, the architect, said this: "The tower, which will form the chief feature of both center and city, was conceived as symbolic of our faith in unity." It was a very complex endeavor. If you have a copy of my book, Game of Gods, I have a whole chapter devoted to Cosmopolis, this idea that we are now searching for an Eden in the world city, and how this plays into the thinking and philosophy of the age that we're in. So Anderson said this. Again, remember, 1913, a change is now felt throughout the entire world. A divine responsibility governs our actions. As we are one with the past, so must we be one with the future. Man's strength can only come through world unification, peace and fellowship, a grandeur coalescence, a world centralization. Then he went on to say this: humanity rising in majestic dignity from earth to heaven. Humanity's mission is to realize that kingdom of heaven on earth, envisioned from within by the Spirit of man. We are going to build heaven on earth. The 1893 Parliament of World Religions was a declaration that we are entering an age when we would be building heaven on earth through religions. Tomorrow afternoon I'll be going through the interfaith movement and demonstrating how this today is now being played out in the Parliament of World Religions. But what happened after 1913? What happened August 1914? Guns boomed and the world went to war, and we slaughtered each other at an industrial level never before conceived in the mind of man. And in the midst of this global crisis, in the midst of the blood and the machinery and the destruction and the fire and the ashes, Nicholas Murray Butler, president of Columbia University, at that time Mr. International, a man who could walk in to the office of president or king or prince or queen, a man who truly was Mr. International in his day. He suggested this. In 1914, in an interview, he said, "The time will come when each nation will deposit in a world federation some portion of its sovereignty for the general good. When this happens, it will be possible to establish an international executive and international police, both devised for the especial purpose of enforcing the decisions of the International Court." We were moving to world order, and he recognized that that's what the war was bringing forth. Consider this, again, this phrase that George Bush Sr. did not make up. The old world order changed when the war storm broke. The old world order died with the setting of that day's sun. And a new world order is being born while I speak. I have a chapter that breaks this all down and shows the history of this movement. And you'll see over and over again that there is hope at that point in time that what we will be able to build after the war is a great era of peace. And it was understood toward the end of World War I that what we were really calling for, especially for Christian men, is that Christian men and women would have to be men of action with a world-mindedness in their thinking. Your duty would be to peace and to world unity. The social gospel movement of the day gravitated very quickly to the idea of world order as being the achievement of what we do as our Christian duty. Frederick Lynch, very important personality in the social gospel movement, said that Christians needed to band together and literally form a compact or League of Nations or some sort of United Nations of the world. He believed that we would bring righteousness from one nation to the next as world order would subsume all nations into itself. It was your Christian duty. Samuel Batten said something else, something very similar, a minister as well, who is very attached in with the social gospel movement. If there's to be a new world, it must come first of all through a new spirit in the nations. There must be created an international mind and consciousness. Men must learn to think of humanity as one family and to have a world patriotism. They must keep their minds free from jealousy and selfishness and base their policy and practice upon true and Christian principles. They must be quick to resent injustice by a nation as by any individual. Humanity must become an ideal in order that it may become an actuality. Listen carefully. World patriotism must be a faith, a chivalry, before it can be an organization. International peace must become an aspiration, a religion, before it will become a reality. There must be some international organization which shall make the new ideas effective and secure world justice. He wrote that in his book entitled The New World Order. And it was circulated to Christians. You could, if you were part of a church that was embracing the social gospel movement of the day, these were the books that you would be reading. And this was the worldview of that time. H.G. Wells puts the concept of world order within the realm of faith as well. In I believe it was in 1928, he published his book, Open Conspiracy, and he talked about the necessity of having a confederation for man. This is just building Babel in our own time. That's what this is. But what's interesting is his statement, one of his opening statements in his introduction. This is, I declare the truth and the way of salvation. I'm sorry, that's a cult. That's political religion. Quit looking at this as conspiracy. Consider it as an alternative salvation message. Because ultimately, that's what this is. That's what man does when we turn our back on the author of life. He went on to say in his book, The Open Conspiracy, the character of the open conspiracy will now be plainly displayed. It will have become a great world movement as widespread and evident as socialism and communism. It will largely have taken the place of these movements. This is 1928. It will be more. It will be a world religion. This large, loose, assimilatory mass of groups and societies will be definitely and obviously attempting to swallow up the entire population of the world and become the new human community. The law of integration. This brings us to World War II. World War II. And the idea of world peace and world order becomes so enmeshed in World War II. And it becomes so public. This was not a conspiracy at the time. The idea of world order was considered to be a practical Christian response to the war and the destruction that we saw. And so John Foster Dulles, back in the 1940s, was put in charge of a special committee with the Federal Council of Churches. And the Federal Council of Churches looked to find a way to secure world order. And they viewed this as coming only through world government. Here's one of their statements. The ultimate requirement is a duly constituted world government of delegated powers, an international legislative body, an international court, with adequate powers and adequate international police forces and provisions for worldwide economic sanctions. It's not the Prince of Peace. We're not interested in the Prince of Peace coming to give us his world order. No, we're going to construct it in our own image. We're going to build heaven on earth. And the Methodist Council of Bishops initiated a crusade for world order, and the Northern Baptist Convention held world order crusades, and there was letter-writing campaigns that your churches were doing to FDR saying, we need world order, we need world government. Seriously, If you want to go through and see the documentation, I have it in my book, Game of Gods. Here's the Southern Baptist Convention, their statement from 1946, taken from their annual meetings, their statement from the Special Committee on World Peace. We believe that the goal of peacemakers must be a world organized on the Christian principles of order and justice. We further believe that in the field of international relations, such a goal can be accomplished only by some type of world government. Accordingly, we recommend that Southern Baptists endorse the principles of World Federation and work toward amending and improving the United Nations organization to achieve that end. This wasn't conspiracy. This was the talk of the day. Not only that, you could join. In fact, you still can. There still are public organizations dedicated to this cause. But in the 1940s, there was a plethora of organizations that you could join, membership organizations that would help lobby and push for world order and world government. The big one that emerged out of the 1940s was the United World Federalists. And by 1947, it had 17 branches and 350 chapters in the United States with over 40,000 members. Your grandparents may have joined. Your church minister at that time may have been a member. It brought to itself all kinds of very influential personalities. I hear some letters, and yes, I have access and have had access to its historic archives, its documents. So here's just one example. I have a U.S. State Department letter endorsing World Federation and World Federalism as the way forward. Governor of New Jersey in 1950 had a letter signed, enacted, put in place saying the state of New Jersey supports the idea of world federalism. Church groups jumped on board, educators, labor organizations. The list is long. Because at that point in time, it was public. This wasn't conspiracy. This was hope. Here's a few other letters, some examples. Yes, the Republican National Committee was sending letters of endorsement for world federalism, sending delegates to United World Federalist meetings. The Democrats were doing the exact same thing, sending delegates to World Federalist meetings. Why? Because everybody believed this was our way forward. The Evangelical Lutheran Church was sending delegates. The National Council of Methodist Youth were initiating campaigns and crusades and putting forth declarations. In fact, in 1952, you might have even had your church hold a World Government Sunday. In California especially, there was an incredible push on by the United World Federalists that churches need to get on board, especially in California, because of its influence. California is a place where things happen, and it just moves out, right? And it was a national-wide campaign, but 500 church leaders in Southern California were specifically asked to deliver sermons and messages endorsing world order. And so April 27th, 1952 was World Government Sunday. This is the document, even with suggested passages that you could use, some scripture lessons, some recommended readings. Fascinating, though, by this time there was already a bit of pushback. And in some of the documentation I have regarding the World Government Sunday, the World Federalists were saying to ministers, look, don't put our name there. It's your idea. Make this your idea. You'll see why in a moment. Winston Churchill, the bulldog of the UK, the savior of England, was a firm believer in world order. At the end of World War II, he was going around the world, literally. He came to the US, he gave speeches in England, saying that what we need is an effective world government. This is from his 1947 speech in Albert Hall. The creation of an authoritative, all-powerful world order is the ultimate aim towards which we must strive. Unless some effective world supergovernment can be set up and brought quickly into action, the prospects for peace and human progress are dark and doubtful. Again, keep in mind, this was not conspiracy. You could join. and your neighbors may have even joined. Certainly your university profs did, and a lot of your town councilors and political leaders of the day firmly believed in world order as a path of salvation. What happened? What happened? When did this become conspiracy? Because that's how we're viewed with it now, right? This is a conspiracy theory. No, it's not conspiracy. The Korean War came about, and all of a sudden it was evident to the world that the two superpowers couldn't get along. Your idea of world order is premised that you can work in unity, and here we're blowing each other to pieces on the Korean Peninsula. And that right there began to erode in a significant way that there is this utopian hope that we can all be together. Not just that, it was also the time when the Red Scare was beginning. And there was legitimate reasons that we had concerns of communist red infiltration in America, because it was happening. And so as these two things were taking place, the public mood was shifting. Remember, world government was accepted as a public good, but now the public mood was shifting. The public became disenfranchised with the idea of world government, and the whole movement went away from being a membership, grassroots, on-the-ground movement, led by elites, but you were all accepting of it, to one where the general public was saying, no, we're backing away, and the elites maintained their involvement without public input. A shift had taken place, and we began to engage in cultural memory loss. Basically, the idea of public support of world government was abandoned, and then we forgot it. And a world order moved into the cultural shadows, and by the 1990s, we were talking about it as conspiracy theory, even though world government organizations, world federalist organizations, were still very, very active. Indeed, the World Federalist Movement is still the umbrella organization for world government, a world government lobby group with its headquarters in New York City. It has an American branch called the Citizens for Global Solutions. It has a Canadian branch. It has branches across Europe, and it has it is an umbrella for other organizations that are of a like mind. It is also a key support entity for the United Nations. It birthed the International Criminal Court. I watched it because I had embedded myself with the World Federalists for a time. And literally, this is their entity. The International Criminal Court was their entity. They framed the military doctrine, which probably none of you in this room have ever heard of, called responsibility to protect. Responsibility to protect says this: if a national government is incapable of securing the peace for its own people, the international community has the responsibility to militarily intervene and secure peace. When NATO went into Libya a number of years ago, it did so under the pretext of R2P. It was the international community saying, Gaddafi doesn't have control anymore. We now will go in with our military and we will secure peace. Look how that worked. I saw this in a very real way back in the year 2000. At that point, I had already attended a number of World Federalist meetings in Dallas, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. And I had been brought into the United Nations as an independent expert on globalism. And for 1 week, I watched as we played Building a New World Order. Yes, there's my security clearance. And my hair was a different color back then. And my face looked a lot younger. And now I feel a lot older. But that's my bona fides. I was there. I was part of a group called Subgroup 6, with the title Strengthening and Democratizing the United Nations. And for 1 week, Subgroup 6, we worked through what it would mean to reconstruct the United Nations. So we talked openly about the necessity of creating a global parliament to work alongside the United Nations, or have the UN itself become a world parliament, implementing world laws that we all will adhere to. We need some type of United Nations-controlled international police force. We need a world tax to pay for the idea of global management, including, before I came down here, I went through some of the papers. All my reams and reams of reports that came out of that event. We were talking about building a world order around carbon taxes. We would pay our carbon tax, and the whole world would be all paying carbon taxes for a world government. And yes, my country is talking about, we pay now a carbon tax. Your country's talking about the same thing. It's the Green New Deal, right? None of this just comes out of the vacuum. Your Green New Deal didn't come out of a vacuum. The ideas have been in place for a long time. And we talked about how the United Nations would oversee the world financial system. None of this has come to fruition, but it demonstrates just how complex and how focused and how serious the thinking is. And in all of this, it was couched this way: this is our best hope. This is our hope. Not the Prince of Peace. The construction of our own peace is our hope. That is a religious way of thinking. Here's a few snippets from some of the circulated texts at the United Nations Millennium Forum. Subgroup 5 asks the question, is it time to consider a world environmental agency, maybe a world central bank or a world government? Subgroup 5 asks the question, does the United Nations need to be transformed into a kind of world parliament? Another circulated declaration said this: religious and spiritual dialogues, this is what we need, religious and spiritual dialogues to promote shared ethics and values in service to the United Nations. Hey, I just watched that in November when I was at the Parliament of World Religions. We'll be talking about that tomorrow. The United Nations Association of Spain said, a global world requires global responses and a system of world government. Here's one that's a real doozy. I don't know how many of these documents are in existence right now. As far as I know, you can only pick them up in two places: at the Millennium Forum, which I attended, and then a couple of months later at another World Forum that took place in New York City. The document is entitled Transformation of the World by one of the leading figures in the World Turkic movement. And in the book, or in the document, he has a world king, a humanistic world king, imparting justice in the world together. This is what he said. The world does need a civilized coordinator in international relations and in settling global problems. More than that, this coordinator must be a stabilizing factor, actually the last-ditch authority on the earth. He must win confidence of each man and each nation. People must be stark sure that this coordinator would solve any problem in a just and humane way. And one should be sure that in him we would find understanding and sympathy, that he would treat any nation as his own son. Can the world community do without a coordinator? Definitely not. Where does that take us? Man's best hope. Tessie Aderon, the chairperson for the United Nations Millennium Forum and one of the leading figures within the international Baha'i international community, put it this way in his opening speech. He told us this is what was happening. This is what we were doing. As this new millennium begins, we are all increasingly coming to realize that in our diversity, we are one human family. The only way we can survive the challenges ahead is to stand together. In this regard, we have no choice but to follow this path of global inclusion and to recognize and affirm our essential oneness. This is the political expression of really the pagan ideal that we are all one. I'm going to quickly jump ahead to something a little more recent, and this is the last World Federalist event I've been to back in the year 2012. It took place in Winnipeg, the capital of my home province, and it was the 26th International Congress of the World Federalist Movement. They meet roughly every 4 to 6 years in a global city. Winnipeg is not a global city. Believe you me, it's not a global city. It's not Rome, it's not Paris, it's not London, but there's a reason. There's a very influential person involved in the World Federalist Movement, its current international president, and he was a high-ranking member of our Canadian government in the 1990s, and he is in Winnipeg, and so that's where it was held. So for 1 week, roughly 1 week, we discussed almost identical issues to what we discussed at the United Nations Millennium Forum. We need a democratic order through a world parliament. We need to empower the United Nations with strong legal powers. We need to create a new court system, an international environmental court. We need to have some type of environmental connection to the global economy, and that would come through a carbon tax. And I have all this waiting in the wings for the next world crisis. And the theme that came through over and over again is we must unite before we destroy each other. Because it was recognized that as World War I gave us the League of Nations, World War II gave us the United Nations, yes, we need something to bring us about as the final stage of world government. What will that be? What will the next crisis of magnitude be? Because it has to be a crisis of magnitude. It can't just be a ripple in the economy. It just can't be one region of the world going at it. It can't just be Pakistan and India scuffling at the border. It has to be a crisis of magnitude. So here's a chart. This was given to us at that event. Off in the distance is wars and disasters threatening humanity. The sunshine that's going to be over the peak is all the related activities of education, raising our consciousness, world citizenship movements. That's what's illuminating us as we all move up the mountain to the top of world federalism. We're all moving to that mountaintop of where we are all one politically. And so there's 4 different options that we were told we need to look at pursuing. We need to pursue all 4 options at the exact same time, such as creating a world constitution. Maybe we can unite the democracies. That was an idea already being pitched in the 1940s. England, America, Canada, we can unite and we can form a unified world democratic system. Or integrate the regions, the EU, with all the other regions that may come up. Hey, we know the EU right now is struggling. It's in crisis. Absolutely. None of this is straightforward. It gets messy. Nonetheless, the idea moves on, moves on, moves on. Or transform the United Nations. And of course, the big one coming up in the next little while is that there is a big UN anniversary happening in only a couple of years. Already there's a lot of talk that this is the opportunity to reform it into something more potent and more powerful. I had a friend with me that summer. I took her to the World Congress, and she was my intern for a summer. A lovely young lady, had a great time with her. She's good friends of ours. And so she came with, and this is her observations. This is what she witnessed while she was at the Congress. All of us present at the Congress were told that we are waiting for that one historic tipping point. It will be at that tipping point when world government will seem more acceptable to the now hesitant nation states, for it will seem more necessary to ensure human survival. I can't help but view this with horror and confusion. Horror at the thinly veiled hope for crisis, and confusion at the mixed message this sends. As the week unfolded and I heard more and more references to the need for a crisis in order to unify, I realized that the leaders of the World Federalist movement were very aware of the same issue I was. In our efforts to unite, we may have to destroy each other. Jean Stapleton. I'm going to wrap it up with her in terms of evidence. Jean Stapleton, who was an advocate and supporter of world federalism, had an endorsement put on a World Federalist pamphlet, which I have in my office. And this is what she says. The goal of the World Federalists is peace through unity of government. We must support their vision of oneness in diversity, for it is the salvation of humanity. I'm sorry, that's religious. That's the cult of world order. Quit viewing this as a conspiracy. View it for what it is, an alternative redemption story. Babel projected to now in the hopes that we can, ourselves, without God, build our own peace and security. We are creating the world city. We are coming together. And there's a problem of Christian gullibility. A number of years ago, I was at a Christian event in my home province of Manitoba, talking to a board member of a fairly large Christian aid and support organization. And the topic of internationalism popped up. And at one point he stopped and said, I fully support a single global currency. And I went, what? What? And as we worked through this, I realized he was an internationalist. He believed that we will create peace on earth. We will build heaven on earth. Or how about Jim Wallace, CEO of Sojourners, the leftist Christian organization? In 2010, when he was at Winnipeg at the World Religion Summit, when religions of the world converged in my home province, in my community, with World Federalists at the head of the World Religion Summit, he was there saying what we need to do is all come together, all of them, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, Baha'is, Sikhs, they're all holding hands and making political statements that what we need to save us is the world coming together, and we need to do this politically. Or how about Brian McLaren, the father of the emergent church movement? Please take the time to read through his book, Everything Must Change, Jesus, Global Crisis, and Revolution of Hope, and read it with a critical mind. Or better yet, just get my book, I talk about it. That's a shameless plug, isn't it? And in that book, in his volume, he talks about how what we need to do is come together as a global community of communities, spouting the internationalism of Jim Garrison, who was the founder of the Gorbachev Foundation. This is what we need to do. Salvation, it's not individual salvation. What we need is collective salvation. And how are we going to achieve collective salvation? By coming together in unity, by building our Babels. Because Babel is mankind saying we save ourselves. We don't need God. We build the fort. We build the city. We build the tower. God, you're not welcome. So we build our technological towers of Babel. We build our religious towers of Babel. We build our scientific and our political and cultural towers of Babel. Because that's what we do. As we seek transformation in our transgression against God. Psalm 2 says this. We're going to be wrapping up. Why then the nations rage, and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. What does God do? How does God respond? He who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath. There is judgment. There is judgment. When we build our Babel, there is judgment. For the Lord is great and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods. For all the gods of the peoples are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Let the heavens rejoice. Let the earth be glad. Let the seas roar and all of its fullness. For he is coming. For he is coming to do what? Judge the earth. This is in Psalms. He shall judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with truth. And then Psalm 113 says, from the rising of the sun to its going down, the Lord's name is to be praised. The Lord is high above the nations, his glory above the heavens. All right, you have your choice of two roads, folks. You really do. We either choose to follow the God who is other, or we engage in whatever broad path of oneness we imagine. We either engage in the cult of world order, building heaven on earth, interfaithism, whatever it may be, or we trust Christ as our Savior, the Prince of Peace, and quit sacrificing truth on the altar of human peace, because that's what we do. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for considering this presentation. I know it's heavy with evidence and material that will help you to maybe understand how this is really a cult. World order is not just politics, it's religion. Tim?